let's get started setting up behavior trees and maybe also tweaking some of the code that we did last time to get up to date with using our more sophisticated behavior tree based methods. So first things first, we're going to go into our dialog component where we have but a single function for running a single dialog tree. Obviously, that's not exactly what we're going to want to do. We're going to want to add a new function, which will be run dialog tree. And this one will actually be fairly simple. We're going to steal quite a bit of code from the run dialog tree. That being, we're going to steal the creation of the widgets, and we're going to be adding it to the viewport, and we're going to be setting our dialog box variable. We're not going to be adding any widgets to the stack, because this is going to be behavior that we do inside of the behavior tree itself. But we can copy and paste everything else over and connect it up just like that. And after we have done that, we can run the behavior tree. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to get the owner of this component, and then we're going to get the AI controller on that actor, and we want to check whether or not this is valid to begin with, because if this is on a actor that doesn't have an AI controller for whatever reason, we don't want to be able to run this at all. But if this is valid, that means that we have an AI controller, which means that we very much can run a behavior tree. The behavior tree is going to need to get an asset in for which behavior tree to run. I like to promote this just to a variable. You can dynamically set what behavior tree it should run at what time if it is a variable, and you can also set it to a default value. So let's promote this to a variable. We'll call it BT assets, and I'm going to be exposing it so that we can change it in the blueprint editor or even in the like world editor in the viewport. And for this, we're also going to put in a return value. So if we put in a return node, we'll hook up the return value of the behavior tree. This is just going to tell you whether or not the behavior tree succeeded in running. And if the AI controller itself isn't valid to begin with, we can just return false. In theory, you could maybe get rid of this node altogether, because this will return false if there is no AI controller. I like to just make sure that anytime I access an object, I make sure that it is valid, just as a habit. Even if otherwise it wouldn't lead to any crashes, it's a good habit to get into to check whether or not the objects you're working with are valid. Especially if you're eventually going to move into C++, that has a little bit less safeguards in place for this and is going to cause a lot more crashes. So get into the habit of validating your objects before using them. So that is, by all accounts, everything we need to do to run a behavior tree dialog tree. Now we just need to make the dialog tree. So in order to do that, we're going to need to make a new actor, because of course we made our BP dialog actor, but this is a base actor, meaning that we can't have an AI controller on it, because it cannot be possessed. As you can see, you need to have a pawn because it is possessible and receive input from a controller. So let's call this BP tree dialog actor or something like that, and we will open that up. We'll add a bit of visualization. For this one, I think we're just going to go for like a sphere instead of a cube like we did before. Of course, we're going to be adding a dialog component to it. And you can see we have the assets right here for us to fill in, but we don't have any assets yet to put in there, so we'll do that in a moment. We'll also go into the class settings and implement the interface that we made before, the BPI dialog, for the run dialog function here. So we're going to get our dialog component, and in this case, instead of just running a single dialog, we are going to be running a dialog tree, which has the return value that we set up. And we're going to plug that into the return value of this. This way, when we call the interface function, even if we call it a BP tree dialog actor, if the run dialog tree itself fails for any reason, like we don't supply in a behavior tree asset, this is still going to return false because we didn't actually start a dialog. So we're going to be looking for the next thing that does return true here. If you're confused about that, watch the last video in the series. There we set up a basic interaction system to trigger dialogues in the first place. So now the time has come to create our dialog tree. We're going to be using the behavior tree system that Unreal comes with by default. There is a little bit of a downside to this because starting a new behavior tree will cancel out any currently active behavior trees. Generally speaking, that's good because as you're going into a dialogue with the character, you don't want them to exhibit any other behavior. But it also means that when we end our dialogue tree, we need to restart the behavior tree that the character was running beforehand. But let's call this a behavior tree, or like actually let's call it dialogue tree, DT. Test. And if we open that up, we will see nothing yet because we need a Blackboard asset to go with that. So we can artificial intelligence, we can make a Blackboard, we'll call this BB test, and we can take that Blackboard asset in, and now we can start building our behavior tree. So for this first video, I'm just going to set up a linear bit of dialogue, which is just going to show one thing, then the next, then the next, then the next. Next time around, we'll start introducing choice boxes and influencing an actual like decision tree into the behavior tree. This is just setting up everything that we need to actually implement things like choices later down the line. So for now, all we're going to do is we're just going to put in a sequence, and then we need to make a behavior tree task that is going to be running the dialogue that we want to run. So let's make that. Let's make a new task. We can call that BTT run dialogue. We're going to save that. And then we're going to override one of these functions, and that being the receive execute AI. This gives us the owner controller and the controlled pawn that we're working with. And this is important because we need to get the dialogue component from the pawn that we're working with. Now, since we already have an interface set up for the dialogue, we are currently just using it to run the dialogue, but we can add a new function to this as well. And that'll just be get the dialogue component. It'll just simply have one output, and that will be the dialogue component, which will be of type, you will never guess it, dialogue component, object reference. I misspelled a couple of things there, don't mind that. Now, if we go back into our BP tree dialogue, which is also horribly misspelled, after we save and compile everything about this, we will see that we can get the dialog component. And this is just as easy as dragging in your dialog component from your components tab and just providing that as the return value. There's nothing more to it here. That's just all we need to do. Before we get deeper into constructing this behavior tree task, I want to point out that we're going to set up a temporary version of this that will work with all the code that we have right now. A little bit later on into this same video, we're going to be revising a lot of code that we have set up in the previous couple of videos, because in those videos, they only needed to work with the singular widget. And now we're going to make the system a little bit more robust to the point where it can accept renewed text over and over and over again. That means that at some point in this same video, we're going to come back to this very task and actually redo some of the code about this thing that we're about to make as well. So don't put too much value into the version that you're about to see, but we still need to construct it just for a general understanding of what each bit of code does, at which time, for what reason. Back in our run dialog behavior tree task, we can now from the control pawn get the dialog component. Here as well, we're going to validate, so is valid, whether or not this thing returned any dialog component at all, because if it didn't, we want to finish execute with a no success, in case that is relevant. If it, however, is valid, what we want to do is we want to get our dialog box that this thing holds, because as you might remember, we have this dialog box that gets created, and then we're saving that to a variable so that we can get it in different places. And we're going to be adding a widget to that stack. This is the way that we add a new text to our widgets. So if it is valid, first we're going to be creating a new widget, which will be of type dialog box. It's going to be taking in a text and a delay between letters. The delay between letters I'm just going to keep as default, but the text we're going to promote to a variable, and we're going to expose that so that we can change it on a per node basis in our dialog tree. And that's going to be the thing that we add to that widget stack. Again, these are functions that we made before. If you're confused, do watch the entire series before starting into episode 4. It's kind of weird that you're doing that. But now we get to the fun part, because we can add this text, but now how do we detect when we need to move on to the next text? We want to do that through player input, but we can't really register player input directly in this behavior tree task, so we need to do this through an event dispatcher. We already have something of the sort. We have the dialogue display, and that one has an input action. We just put that there last time as a little bit of a quick and dirty way to deal with all this. We're going to change this into a custom event instead, because input actions, you generally should only have those on characters themselves and not on things like widgets. So we're also going to get rid of everything in the event construct here. Again, we're going to be cleaning up all the code that we put there last time just as a quick and dirty solution. We're going to make a better solution for it now. So this is going to be a custom event, a progress text. And when we tell this thing to progress text, it itself will decide whether or not it will just set the dialog to being finished or whether or not it will end this widget altogether. So we can get rid of the input action for now. We'll get back to that in a moment. And instead of this thing itself deciding, hey, let's set the game input mode and remove itself from parent, what we're going to do is we're going to add an event dispatcher. So we'll add an event dispatcher here called text finished or something of the sort. And that's just going to be calling out. And then anything listening to that is actually going to be the thing that will then decide what code actually runs. Because in some scenarios, we want to remove the entire widget from the screen. Or in some scenarios, instead, what we might want to do is we might want to just progress to the next bit of text. So there's a handful of ways that we can deal with this now. And the way that I'm going to be dealing with it primarily is just the most straightforward way. And that is by dealing with all this through the player character itself. There might be arguments to be made to put some of the code that we're about to make in the game mode or in its own like special HUD class. Generally speaking, the HUD class is deprecated. We don't really use it anymore, but it's still a thing that some people use to like deal with logic for widgets. There's no real reason to do that, but you can. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the dialog component, and we don't actually want to have a dialog box reference in here anymore. We're going to be deleting this variable, and it's going to be invalidating some of these nodes. So we need to go through and just check that everything works now that that is gone. And the reason that we're doing that is as long as anything has a reference to a widget, even if it is removed from the viewport, it will still be around in memory. So if you talk to something once and then leave, as long as that thing is still loaded, it will still have a reference to that widget, and the widget will still be in memory. So you're using up some of your system memory without it actually being useful. So we don't actually want to have references to all those things in every single one of these components. What we're going to do instead is we're going to have one singular place where we can have a reference to the currently relevant dialog box instead, because we only need to interact with one dialog box at a time anyway. So just having one central place for that is a lot easier to deal with. And for us, in this case, that will be in the third-person blueprint. We can do this in the game mode or in the character. Again, I like doing it in the character because the input that we're going to be setting up in a moment also will be in the character. We'll just map it to this jump action in a moment. So let's go into the variable here and set this to active dialog box. Or actually, let's name it properly this time, active dialog display, because it's not a single box, it's the entire display of the whole thing. And we'll set that to a value of WBP dialog display object reference. So we don't need to have this creation in a bunch of places. We'll just deal with that on the player character. Again, a lot of this also might exist on either the game mode or the player controller or the game state or any place that you want it to be. Preferably a place that is client only though, just in case you're making like a multiplayer game or whatever. So let's delete this as well, and then I run single dialog. We're going to be deleting this as well, and we'll get back in a moment to the actual behavior tree stuff, but it's important to set all this up more properly so that the behavior tree stuff can work as seamlessly as possible. So you'll notice that the add widget to stack doesn't work anymore now, because obviously we don't have a reference to the dialog display anymore. We're still creating dialog boxes, but we're not saving those anywhere, so they're not going to be like swarming around in memory or anything. So in order to get that new reference to our newly created dialog display, we'll just get player character or wherever you have stored this, cast it to the third person character, or again, wherever you put this code. And then we will get the dialog display, and that one we can then add this thing to instead. Then back in a player character, I'm going to just on begin play create the widget. We're not going to immediately add it to the viewport, but we will create it right away. So this will be the dialog display, and we will set the variable to that value. Now that we have a variable that holds a reference to that widget, the widget is going to just remain in memory. We can turn it on and off at any time that we want by simply doing a add to viewport and a remove from parent. These are the two functions that are going to make it visible and make it invisible. Or you can just use set visibility if you want to, even to prevent it adding it multiple times to the viewport. With this, it technically still is part of the viewport, so it's taking up some more resources, but negligibly so because it's just one widget. So I'm going to be using this set visibility. We'll just set it to either visible or hidden. And immediately after that, we will add it to the viewport. So it will technically always be on the viewport, but we'll also set visibility immediately to being hidden, so that we can very easily just toggle it between hidden and visible instead of adding it and removing it to the viewport, because that can lead to some weirdness, as I said before, where you can accidentally add things twice and they get hard to deal with. Now, we've changed quite a few things there, and we're going to be going back to this class in a moment, but I think you're here for the behavior tree stuff. So let's go back into our behavior tree task. And instead of getting the dialog box that we're going to be doing stuff with from this dialog component, we don't actually need that anymore. It's still good to have this as a blueprint interface, which is why we went over it in the beginning of the video. We're redoing some stuff, but we're not going to be using this in this direct space anymore, because what we're going to be doing instead is we'll get player character, and of course cast to our third person character. And in this case, we also don't need the is valid anymore or the finish execute. And you can definitely start seeing why doing it this way is a lot smoother to work with, I hope. So we will get the dialog display from the player, and that'll be the thing that we add the widget to. We connect up the execution pins as well. Now we finally get back to what we were doing, and that is setting up this thing to interact with our inputs, because we want the inputs from the character to be sent over to our dialog display and then do something with this behavior tree. So as we make that event dispatcher, we can bind to context finished. We can add that one. And then since we're just in a event graph here, we can just simply make a new custom event to go with that. We'll call this finish, and that will simply finish the execution here with success. So it's going to be waiting for the text finished to call out, and then it will finish this task. So the behavior tree is going to get stuck on this task until we do the input to finish the text off, and then it'll add in the next text. And we'll set up the actual code for that in a moment. And at the very start here, we also want to get our dialog display, and we want to clear the dialog widget so that it removes any dialog that was there already. We can go back into the behavior tree, and now we can run the dialog, and we can just add a few of those in a row. Let's just do 3 of them for now. And it says text, default text. We'll just change the first one to hello, then who are you, and then I've never seen you before. So it'll type out hello, wait for us to input, then it'll type out who are you, and then it'll wait for our input again, and then it'll type out I've never seen you before, and wait for our input again, and then it will rerun the entire tree. So we also need a behavior tree task to end the behavior tree altogether. So let's add a new task based on BT task blueprint base, and we'll call this BTT end dialog. Once again, we're going to receive execute AI, and this is going to be relatively simple. We'll steal a little bit from here because we're going to be casting to the character and all that kind of good stuff. Because first things first, we get the dialog display and we set visibility. As I just talked about, we're going to be setting the visibility here to hidden because we don't need it anymore. But we also, just to be sure, want to clear any dialogue. In case we set it back to visible, we don't want to display any of the last dialogue that was in there. And then we're going to get the controlled pawn, And here it kind of depends on your implementation for your game. In my case, I'm just going to stop the behavior tree. But in your game, you might want to then also restart a different behavior tree that it was running beforehand. So you might want to set up a default behavior tree value on all of your characters and run that behavior tree again when this one stops. We, of course, don't have any other complex behavior happening on any of these dialogue characters, so we don't need to do that. But for a more fully fledged character, you might need to restart different behavior. So that would be on owner controller, you could just run the behavior tree and then you could get that from your control pawn through like an interface or something. In our case, what we're going to do is we're going to get the brain component and we're going to just simply stop logic. Reason will be dialogue finished. This is just for logging purposes, really. And this will finish off your dialogue. So in your dialogue tree, if you have multiple branches, at the end of every single one of your paths, you're going to need to put a end dialogue as well. Also, make sure to compile and save it before adding it to your behavior tree, otherwise it does this. So let's add it again, and dialogue, there we go. Now, a few final things to make this work. We first need to set the dialogue display that we are now storing on the character to being visible whenever we either run a single dialogue or run an entire dialogue tree. So we're already casting to the third person character here in run single dialogue. We already have the dialogue display, so we simply need to set visibility to being visible. And in run dialogue tree, we will just need to do the same thing before doing any of this other stuff. Then again, we want to check whether or not the behavior tree started running in the first place, because if it doesn't, we don't want to set it to visible. So we're going to put in a branching node, and only if it ends up being a valid behavior tree do we do this other stuff. And then we hook that up to the return node as well. We moved around quite a lot of code there. If that's a little bit of a whirlwind for your mind, don't worry. That fully makes sense. You might want to just go back and watch through all that stuff a second time to really understand like what we changed and why we changed it. And if there's still confusion, of course, never be afraid to go down in the comments and ask for any clarifications. Now, the very last thing that we need to do is we are binding to that event dispatcher that we just created on the dialogue display, like right over here. But now we are not really running this progress text function at any point in time at all. So what we can do is we can go into our third person character, and I'm going to bind this to the jump key just because that's the easiest way to do it for me right now. And we'll get the active dialogue display, and we will get is visible or get visibility, but we can just check is visible, because if this is visible, I don't want to jump. So I only want to jump if this is not visible, because if it is visible, what I want to do is I want to progress the text from the active dialogue display instead. And we'll hook that up to the started pin of the jump action. Now, in a similar way, we can also stop you from moving or looking around if this thing is visible. So what we would do there is we just move this input action back a little bit. We put a is visible check at the very start here. So this one goes to the triggered. So only if this is not visible do we take in any values at all. But if it is visible, what we simply do is we add movement input equal to just 0. And the reason we do that is because if we already had movement input when this thing became visible, we want to tell the movement component to, hey, our next movement is going to be 0, instead of just not giving it a new value. Because if you just not give it a new value, it's going to keep walking in the direction that it was already walking. So we can just add a movement input of 0, 0, 0 and 0, 0, 0. Don't need to do all that control rotation shit because it's all going to be zeroed out. We just hook this up like this. And we can do the same thing with the camera inputs if we really want to. So that way we won't be able to rotate the camera around either. So only if is visible is false do we do this. For this one, I don't think it's entirely necessary to add a value of 0 if this thing is visible, because the camera doesn't keep rotating on its own if you let go of like your mouse. But it's good to do regardless. So now let's go and add in, finally, our dialogue tree actor into the world. So now we can walk up to this dude and press our F key and it says, hello, who are you? I've never seen you before. And then we just get our controls back. And you will note that if I click on this guy again, I can't move around, or you can't see me pressing the buttons, but believe me, I'm pressing the buttons. I'm moving my mouse around while I'm talking to this dude. And we can even like skip through the text and everything. And we can walk up to this guy. And again, we can just skip through the text. This doesn't have any removing logic yet because we haven't set that up. So even though it's not behavior tree related, let's also finish up that, because this whole video has been about a part of refactoring our code as well as setting up new code. So in our dialog components, we have this run single dialog, and we add like widget to stack and stuff. We're also going to, from our active dialog display, we're going to bind to onTextFinished. And this time we're actually within a function, so we can't just make a custom event. As you can see, if I try to make a custom event, you can't do that because we're not in a proper event graph. So what we need to do is we need to create an event. And there you can put in an object. In this case, it's just going to be the object itself. And we can match a function to that. So in this case, we can just create a matching function, which we'll call remove dialog display. And if we go into literally any of these things over here, we can just steal, right now I'm in the run dialog behavior tree task, we can just steal the character casting stuff from there and put it into our remove dialog thing. And what that's going to do is it's going to set visibility on this thing back to being hidden. And we might as well, again, just clear the dialog widget while we're at it. As a quick aside that I thought of while editing this video, the remove dialog display, we are casting to the third person character and then doing some stuff with it. So it might make more sense to do this within the third person character itself. So that way you don't have like this get player character and get casting node here. And instead we can just take the set visibility and clear dialog widget from that, move this to the player character, just make a custom event or a function if you prefer in here. And we can call that the same thing that we called the other one, which is end dialog display, I believe. And just use our dialog display reference directly to do that on both of these things. And now we can call this from the player character, which makes a little bit more sense. And we can also very much include the unbind all events with that. Also will make it easier to do stuff like that with BTT and dialog, because we already were casting to this thing anyway. So we can just remove these two and dialog display, and that'll do that. So it is now all within the same function that lives on the player character. So that's just a little bit neater to do that way. And in the dialog component itself, we can now remove this function, and on the run single dialog for the create event, that's not going to work now. But since we already have a cast here to the third person character anyway, we can just put that into the object, and now it's going to be displaying, if we refresh the node, all of the events that exist on our player character. So we can just run the end dialog display on the player character whenever we do our text finish. You can very much bind to events and functions that exist on other objects as well in this way. So that's just a little bit more clear. Just as the whole theme of this video is, there's a bunch of different ways to do literally anything. And the way that I've shown so far in the video was good, but this is probably a little bit easier to do moving forward. But if we just go up to here, now we can see we can also end this dialogue, and our dialogue more or less works. So you'll also see if I am walking and I press the F key, I also stop walking, which is quite important. But now we have a new issue. So you can see we can look through this dialogue a number of times, but if we now end up going over to this guy over here and it says you're smart, you're smart, you're smart, we've now run the single dialogue thing once, and that means that this thing is now properly bound to the finished text on that widget. And that widget will still exist for a certain time period. It's eventually going to get deleted from memory because it doesn't have any references anymore anywhere. But for now, it will still exist. So if I go over to this guy now, you can see that every time I press the spacebar button, it deletes the entire widget or sets it to invisible. So For that, we also want to make sure that we get player character, do like all this stuff in the dialogue component, and then on remove dialogue display. Before we end this, we also want to unbind all events from onText finished, because we're now done with this entire thing. So we want to clear out all our onText finished bindings so that we can reset them up later, but they're not going to be interfering with any other stuff, which should fix up that issue right away. So we can talk to this guy, and we can talk to him again. That all is fine, that all works. But if we now go up to this guy, it'll still display the entire dialogue. Well, tree, it isn't really a tree yet, it's a sequence, properly without any issues. So there's been a lot of going back and forth between different classes and different files today, and adding stuff and then removing it again, and a lot of reorganization. But now we have a solid foundation to go forward with to actually set up the behavior tree choices and build out this dialogue system into something fairly usable. With all of the code that we have, we can also later on change it to go to a different method, like using data assets, or again, if you want to get like really advanced with it, entirely custom assets with custom editors and stuff like that, which is something that's way, way, way in the future. We'll maybe cover that at some point down the line. But for now, we have our basic foundations set up. You can effectively create dialogue sequences now. The only thing that's left to do is creating dialogue choices to make a proper dialogue tree.